Oh, hey. You hear about video games? Contrary to what you might believe, we work on more than just computers. As of this past week, Justin has decided to broaden our market by taking on more gaming-related repairs. Justin has failed to note, however, that we are located in close proximity to an old age home and most of our customer base is old enough to qualify for a senior's discount. Hence the lack of focus on anything made within the last decade. Possibly as a result of that, our first gaming console in the shop today is this Sega Saturn. It's almost kind of surreal to have one of these in front of me. I wasn't around for its heyday. Granted, I'm not sure it ever really had one. Like most other things I talk about on here, the Saturn was one of those pieces of childhood unobtainium. I was a big Sega guy growing up, re my hilarious and sometimes frightening obsession with Sonic the Hedgehog. But this console was always shrouded in mystery to me. It was rarely brought up compared to the Genesis or even the Dreamcast other than to poke fun at it. Not even my gamer friends knew much about it. Granted, I would just read wiki pages for fun, so I probably knew more about stuff than your average 8-year-old. Regardless, the more I looked into the Saturn, the more questions were raised than answered. Why was it pushed to the wayside? Did it fail? Did it kill Sega? So now that I have one in front of me, what better time to look into things? Alright, it's the early 90s in the gaming world and the industry was starting to gear up for the next generation of home console technology. Nintendo was hard at work on the Nintendo 64, still dubbed the Ultra 64 at this point, and a newcomer was quickly approaching the scene in the form of Sony's computer entertainment division. Sega was obviously no different, and were working on a next-gen console of their own. The common theme between all three? 3D. In an industry always seeking to innovate, 3D polygonal graphics seemed like the next logical stepping stone in the world of video games. While Sega's high-energy marketing was doing wonders for its current home console, the Genesis, or Mega Drive if you're feeling silly, it also had a strong foothold in the arcade industry with cutting-edge 3D graphics, Virtua Fighter and Virtual Racing being some of the most popular games to feature them. So what better way to beat the other guys to the punch than to bring your already existing arcade experience to the home? Thus, the idea for the Saturn was born. In retrospect, the Saturn's launch was a danger zone from the get-go. Sega had been riding the highs of their flagship Genesis for years now, and while it was still a popular console, it was definitely starting to get a bit long in the tooth. And obviously, Rome was not built in a day. The development of the Saturn was going to need all the time it could get. Add in extra stresses and struggles on the marketing and management sides, and things were fitting to get messy. And messy did they get. These tense times resulted in a laundry list of blunders, questionable decisions, and half-baked ideas from Sega. Most of these ideas involved stretching out the longevity of their existing consoles. There was the Sega CD and 32X, two underdeveloped and overpriced add-on consoles for the Genesis, a console which many sought to be on its deathbed with the new console generation clearly approaching. The Sega CD wasn't much more than a way to play Genesis games on a CD, the main benefits being higher quality audio, potential for larger games, and full motion video, the latter of which being what the console ended up being known for and sparking a controversy of its own in the form of Night Trap and its resulting legal debacle leading to the foundation of the ESRB. But that's a whole other story. The 32X carried its own set of unfortunate circumstances. Its big selling point was its 32-bit architecture. See, there was a so-called bit war going on, which I'll touch more on later. To put it plainly, more bits equals good. At least that's what the marketing was saying at the time. The increase in power that the 32X sought to bring to the Genesis ended up being a double-edged sword, though. Why spend the money to make my dying console 32-bit when there's a full-fledged one just around the corner? And by around the corner, I don't mean like in a couple months or a year or so. No, the 32X launched in the US the day before the Saturn was released in Japan. This rush of a stopgap release meant that not only was the 32X library small, but most games didn't even fully utilize its technology. Put all this together, and Sega wasn't exactly in good standing going into the Saturn's launch cycle. But just wait. If you thought the so-called Tower of Power dealt damage to Sega, Judgment Day was still approaching. Sega had anticipated a later US launch for the Saturn, releasing the 32X the holidays prior to account for such. But Sega of Japan was adamant on beating Sony's PlayStation to market. After already announcing a September 1995 release date, aptly dubbed Saturn Day, earlier in the year, a last-minute decision dragged the launch up to May 11th, the day of the very first Electronic Entertainment Expo. Tensions were high at E3 1995, with both Sega and Sony set to announce their contenders for the inevitable 5th-gen console war, and Sega would be the first to showcase their new arrival. Sega of America head Tom Kalinske took the stage and announced the Saturn would launch at a price of $399, and that the first wave of units had already shipped to a select group of retailers. much to the outrage of excluded stores like KB Toys, who would end up refusing to carry the console. Following this keynote, it was Sony's turn. They started their spiel about the PlayStation and its CD-ROM technology before inviting Steve Race, the head of the North American PlayStation Group, on stage to deliver the biggest and first of many blows to the Saturn.
$299.
Also, Michael Jackson was there for some reason, which is kind of funny considering his existing relationship and future collaborations with Sega. But you know, undercutting the Saturn by $100, the PlayStation would go on to outsell Sega by virtually every metric. To add insult to injury, the Saturn launched with a measly 6 games, all of which being first-party, as the third-party developers had planned around the original Saturn Day launch. Not that the games were necessarily bad. Panzer Dragoon and Clockwork Knight both went on to become cult classics, and decent ports of Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA put Sega's strong arcade roots on display. But compared to the heavy hitters that Sony launched with, like Ridge Racer and Rayman and the Psygnosis-developed Wipeout, paired with a console that cost a whole $100 less, the Western release of the Saturn was over before it even began. The Saturn would also end up lacking a fundamental part of any Sega console, that being a flagship Sonic title. That's right, beyond a pretty decent version of Sonic 3D Blast, a mediocre racing game called Sonic R, and a collection of the Genesis titles in the form of Sonic Jam, the Saturn never saw a full-scale Sonic game in its lifetime. Not to say that there wasn't one planned, quite the contrary. A Sonic game was being developed for the Saturn as far back as 1994. This game was Sonic Xtreme, a 3D platformer that was supposed to bring Sonic properly into the next console generation. But after numerous roadblocks, general development hell, and somehow more than one near-death experience, the game would end up being cancelled in 1996. This wouldn't be an entirely fruitless effort, though. Some elements of this game would end up in other places like Sonic Jam's 3D Overworld and eventually be reworked into Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast. But with no Sonic game to sell their console with, the Saturn would continue to struggle. Got something in my eye. That can't be healthy. Marketing. If the Saturn wanted to stand any chance against the bombshell price drop of the PS1, they had to market it like their life depended on it. Sega had always been a powerhouse in the advertising game, going head-to-head with Nintendo in the last console generation. Genesis does what Nintendo don't, blast processing, whatever the f*** Europe had going on. Sega knew how to sell their stuff. But instead of sticking to their guns and taking a similar approach to what they did with the Genesis, they decided to make the Saturn's ads batshit insane. One of the first things I saw about the Saturn when I was a kid was this crazy promo tape from around the console's launch. It reeks of the 90s, which is a good thing, I think. It's chock full of fun characters. Saturn Lady, Gray Man, Chill Guy, Ballerina Biker. So much to love.
Sega Saturn.
I think the thing that stands out most about this tape is how everything is always clashing. The segments hold no relation to one another other than the console that they're promoting. Hell, the gameplay footage doesn't even fit the music being played over it. Look at that. High energy. Also, this font? I do understand the contrast between calmer sections and fast-paced ones are meant to jump out at you, but more often than not it just ends up being kinda jarring. I do like the theater of the eye bits though. Their general TV ads were a bit more standard Sega fare. Confrontational, poking fun directly at their competitors. They couldn't keep it at that though. They had to let the crazy poke through a bit in the form of this godforsaken gelatinous screaming head. Now on the flip side, Japan's Saturn ads were also fucking crazy. Introducing segata Sanshiro, a legendary martial artist with a passion for the Saturn. This guy's one of the most memorable things about the Saturn's run in Japan. He's just a guy who beats the shit out of people until they play video games. Children, partygoers, inanimate objects, he does not discriminate. Here's a brief list of things that Segata Sanshiro has done. Gone clubbing, played baseball, threw a guy so hard he fucking exploded, delivered presents, coached a soccer team, rescued people from a burning building, got attacked by zombies, found love, and finally jumped on a missile directed for Sega HQ, flipped that shit, flew into space, and exploded. A life well lived, to say the least. They even gave him a minigame collection for his efforts. I think as wacky as these ads were, they still hold up, especially compared to what we got in the West. Segata Sanshiro was crazy, but this was just weird. Regardless of country, the marketing for this console feels like a fever dream and is infinitely more memorable than the actual product they were trying to sell. Another thing that was at very least a setback for the Saturn was also supposed to be its biggest asset. The Saturn had dual 32-bit Hitachi SH2 processors, which, on paper, was incredibly technically impressive compared to its contemporaries at the time. Not only were they decent processors, but they were also a standard component compared to the specialized MIPS processor in the PlayStation. In theory, this console should have been a joy to work with. Keyword theory. Yeah, the fact that there were two processors should have been a welcome bonus, but they were heavily bottlenecked due to the fact that they shared a memory bus and couldn't access it at the same time. This made for an optimization nightmare that was exacerbated by the fact that there were little to no higher-level dev tools or SDK provided for developers. Saturn games had to be written in assembly as opposed to something like C, which is what Sony's SDKs used. The Saturn was also weird with how it handled 3D graphics, which was obviously not good because that was a selling point at the time. The Saturn used quads for polygons as opposed to the triangle-based graphics of the PS1, which were not as easy to work with or as efficiently rendered as the latter. This all brings us back to the bit wars. Outside of being glorified marketing mumbo-jumbo, bits were something that all of the consoles were striving to utilize. Everyone wanted more bits. However, as was clearly evident with things like the Atari Jaguar and Panasonic 3DO, it's not the number of bits that matters, but what you do with them. More bits could mean something like this, or this.
Take your damn clothes off!
But the so-called bit marketing worked, at least somewhat. Consumers were seeing the shift from primarily 2D games to new 3D ones, and in their eyes, this was the future. They wanted whatever did that best. This would be another blow to the Saturn because, as 3D was a bitch to program for, many of the Saturn's standout titles were 2D. While these games might be great, the technical leap that the public was expecting to see between generations and was seeing with the Nintendo 64 and PS1 wasn't nearly as evident with much of the Saturn's library. The complexity of the Saturn's architecture would also go on to affect the console's legacy in that it was incredibly hard to emulate for a long time. I don't think there was a good Saturn emulator until like the late 2010s. Most of them never left early dev stages and couldn't play commercial games. Nowadays, there's new versions of Mednafen and Yabaus. Those seem to do the job. I remember having the most luck when I was younger running SSF on the family Windows XP machine, but for the most part, you'd either need a pretty beefy computer or be content with 10 frames per second on average. After all was said and done, Sega decided the Saturn wasn't worth pursuing longer than they had to. Tom Kalinske would leave Sega with Bernie Stolar to replace him, a former executive at Sony who would go on to put the final nail in the Saturn's coffin at E3 1997, stating that it was not their future. A bold move considering that the company was at least a whole 2 years away from their follow-up in the form of the Dreamcast. Sega decided to fully focus on their future console, spreading their own rumors about it to build hype, but in return completely neglecting the Saturn and its library. Many big titles that started development for the Saturn got moved over to the Dreamcast like Sonic Adventure and Shenmue. Sega abandoned the Saturn and any chance it had at being an attractive purchase. Its discontinuation would follow with a total of only 8 games being released in North America in 1998. The Saturn was dead before the decade's end, with Sega seemingly following suit in years to come. So yeah, kinda sad, right? So much potential squandered right off the bat. But what if I told you that there was an alternate universe where the Sega Saturn was actually relatively successful? What if that alternate universe was called Japan? Yeah, contrary to almost everything I've said so far, the Saturn was only really a failure on paper and was actually Sega's best-selling console in Japan. It was basically a home arcade console. Relatively faithful ports, great 2D graphics, and pretty much everything about the Saturn went better in Japan. Its launch was more successful, dropping a month earlier than the PlayStation with a port of Virtua Fighter, a game which was already incredibly popular in the arcade world. PlayStation caught up in sales eventually, but the Saturn kept pace well into its lifespan before developers started focusing more on the Dreamcast. In addition to a successful launch, Sega of Japan just seemed to understand its audience a bit better. Sega of America didn't think that 2D fighters and RPGs would be big sellers in the States, and to nobody's surprise, that would not end up being the case. Because of the greater popularity of the Saturn in Japan, their library was immensely more vast than what we got in North America. Let's talk about that library, shall we? Though few and far between, the Saturn did have some bangers. Nights into Dreams is definitely one of the console's standouts. It's a quirky 3D platformer? I actually don't know what I'd call this game. Wikipedia refers to it as an action game, but that's not very descriptive. You're a little purple guy and you fly in circles collecting shit and fight big creatures. This is one of those games that's definitely more memorable in terms of its aesthetic or vibe rather than its gameplay, at least in my opinion. It ended up being pretty popular too. There was even a Christmas version of it that has one of my favorite video game related songs, a soulful a cappella rendition of the game's theme led by Marlon Saunders.
In a dream I could see you are not far away. Anytime, any place, I can see your face.
There was the aforementioned Sonic R, a game where Sonic and his friends blast through racetracks on foot at the speed of a leisurely stroll. Virtua Fighter, Sega Rally, Panzer Dragoon. There were actually quite a few hits that the Saturn brought to the table. I'm not going to touch too much on these big games though, there's plenty of other people who have way more to say about them and can probably do a better job than me. But in addition to the games that most people know about, the Saturn had a lot more than meets the eye. Like mahjong. Lots and lots of mahjong. The Saturn, like most other consoles on the Japanese market, had a lot of card and tabletop games. Pachinko too, which makes sense considering Sega's history in the coin-op arcade industry. It also, like I said earlier, had a lot of arcade ports. Aside from Virtua Fighter, there were other arcade ports like Daytona USA, House of the Dead, and the other installments in the Virtua series. There were also ports of 2D fighters like Street Fighter and the original Marvel vs. Capcom. One of my favorite fighters for the Saturn is probably Fighting Vipers. It's got a cool cast of characters, fun gameplay, and f***ing Pepsi Man. It also holds a soft spot for me because of its connection to the oft-forgotten Sonic the Fighters. Honey from Fighting Vipers even made an unofficial hidden appearance in the game. On top of arcade games, the Saturn's other big seller was RPGs. The Sakura Wars series was a hit in Japan that never made it stateside, though there is an English patch version of the first game available online nowadays. Another big market, sim games. Racing sims, sports sims, fishing sims, and most importantly, dating sims. There are so many freaking dating sims on here. One of which is this. Marriage. I got this game at the Game Swap I talked about in my CRT video a while ago. Imagine you're me, flipping through Japanese Saturn games, having no idea what any of them say, and solely going off of cover art. And then you see this. Anime woman in a gown. The only English title in the whole stack, big red text that just says marriage. What choice did I have but to pick this up? This disc is actually the sole reason I started making this video. Which is very unfortunate because as it turns out it's not actually that interesting. It's a pretty run-of-the-mill dating sim. The art style is pretty nice, but the gameplay isn't really anything to write home about. Its blandness is even harder to ignore because of the fact that I do not speak Japanese. I played this game with a couple pals, one of whom does know a little bit of the language, and it was an interesting experience to say the least. Alright, let's play Marriage.
The watercolor is awesome.
Yeah, this is beautiful.
Whoa.
Yo, he's from Alberta? That's crazy. What's our last name?
Smith. A young person subsisting on part-time work. Huh?
Oh, is this our occupation and our salary?
Oh, maybe.
I don't know what the f any of this shit says, man.
Dude, it's gonna be so bad when we get to only dialogue.
What building is this? These are just real pictures with a shitty filter over them. Information.
We got 0 races done.
We got 0 races?
And 0 airplanes. Wait, we got 0 English.
No!
That makes a lot of sense. That explains a lot. Alright. Alright! Call her!
Are we calling her up? Oh, we have them on speed dial. Yo, let's call her up.
Is this Arai-san? Oh no.
You can do it, Slush. I believe in you. But it's pretty cool that she happens to be in the marriage agency's data. I'm sure she'll be surprised too.
Hi, Arai desu.
Oh my god. Hi. We're okay, I think the bit is that... Wait, so is this... There's a marriage agency? Oh, that's why the paperwork was on the desk. Those pictures were of the marriage agency.
Oh.
So all these ladies are single and ready to mingle.
And they went to an agency because they're so holeless.
That's crazy. Yeah, actually, I was introduced by a marriage consultation agency.
Marriage consultation agency.
Is that what that says?
Yeah.
I think we should get Slush. You want to help me make a translation patch for this game?
No, that sounds awful. Enter this day in the schedule. I can translate that.
Is that hold on, I can't see. Saturday.
Not Saturday.
Sunday. Okay, should we do Saturday?
Oh yeah.
Let's do Saturday.
Oh my gosh, look how cute it is.
Oh my god.
I think that's her name.
This is what real gaming is right here.
Yeah, this is game of the year.
What the fuck is? What does that say?
There's rest.
Self-discipline.
Okay.
What is that supposed to mean? Self-discipline. Oh wait. Hold on. We have options. Sports gym, English conversation, driving school.
We gotta do that one. Do that every day.
Oh wait, maybe we should go to driving school.
Driving school?
We should go to driving school to impress drivey girl.
That's how I feel like our life before this date was like we
English
just slept on a
school.
Sunday.
That was incredibly uneventful. I thought we were at the very least gonna get some like cutscenes or
Yeah, I
something.
thought we were gonna get like a mini game
No,
or
we
something.
set him up for tomorrow.
No, it is tomorrow. Yeah, no, we went to sleep. We just did those graphics on the screen were what we just did.
Oh, I missed it. That's
Damn.
so lame.
See, this is so lame.
What else can we do in here?
We gotta book more thing. We can look at our stats, and we can look at our stats, and we can look
And we
at
can look
women,
at our stats.
and we can look at our stats. I guess we just go to sleep again until this date, because
We're on that grind. This is what it feels
This
like.
is how I manage my time. I just sleep until I have to do something.
this is teamwork. This is literally.
We're about to go on our first
This is
date
literally
soon.
Inside Out. we're just the emotions inside Steve Smith's head. Something. Oh, woman.
Girl.
Oh wait, we have things that we can do. I don't like any. I don't want to touch the hand symbol, not by a long shot.
So we can either look, hand, or mouth.
Wait, No. Let's look into her beautiful eyes.
You went on a date with
How are
a
you
girl
doing?
at a fucking train station? That was your location of choice?
No, okay, it's a day-long date, and this is where we're meeting.
Why? I just realized
Eminem.
she's doing the fucking Eminem hand. Today was fun. Please invite me again if you like.
That was it?
Damn, that was a short ass date. Well then, bye.
Bye.
This game kind of sucks, dog. In contrast to the PlayStation, a console I heavily associate with its music and early rhythm games, the Saturn didn't have much in the way of music-based games. There was the aptly titled Jung Rhythm, an attempt to piggyback off of Sony's Parappa the Rapper series, and that's exactly what it does. It's basically just Parappa on the Saturn. Once again, I do not speak Japanese and cannot glean much of the plot, but its presentation is cute, and its gameplay is about what you'd expect from a Parappa clone. Otherwise, I don't really have much to say about it. Another that I played was called DJ Wars, a game that sounds and looks way cooler than it actually is. Now, you may not know this, but I've actually DJ'd quite a few wild gigs in my time. I knew how to bring the house down. That is to say that this is not bringing the house down. This game is another Japan exclusive, and as such, I could not understand any semblance of story structure, and thus my opinion is based solely on gameplay. This is a game where you DJ. Who would have guessed it? It's an interesting concept that they tried to pull off. It's not as stylized as something like DJ Hero would go on to be. This is the bare bone essentials of what DJing in a video game counts as. You choose songs, and you mix. It's kind of neat in that it revolves around more old school methodology like manual tempo matching, which makes sense because I don't think it would be very much fun to hit a sync button in this context. But yeah, while this game has an interesting concept overall, the execution is a bit lacking and the gameplay gets old pretty fast. The Saturn, like many other Japanese consoles, also had its fair collection of experimental art. The Japanese video game market is often poked fun at for its oddities, and the Saturn is no exception. One you might have heard about is the Parodius series, a lighthearted spin-off of the Gradius franchise. The Saturn saw the first two of these in a compilation called Gokujo Parodius Da Deluxe Pack. It's a pretty run-of-the-mill shoot-em-up, or cute-em-up as the internet seems to describe this one. wacky enemies, overstimulating graphics, and a whole lot of references I don't get. Another interesting one is Warp's D, a weird horror adventure game. It's like a big interactive FMV movie where you try to solve a murder mystery in a hospital that's actually a castle. It's very slow, like really slow. Each FMV animation moves at a snail's pace and you just have to wait for them to finish before you can interact with anything. This one actually isn't a Japanese exclusive, but it was made by a Japanese dev and it's weird, so I'm counting it. Finally, we have Pulirula, a port of an old Taito arcade beat-em-up. This is a game I probably couldn't describe even if I could understand it. There's a guy with a key and there are robots and they turn into animals when you shoot them, and there is ladies swinging and lady legs and humping men and water and fish. Honestly, what else is there to be said? A little addendum about getting games in the modern day. For reasons previously stated, Japanese Saturn memorabilia is way more plentiful and reasonably priced than their US equivalents. For that reason, I own a Japanese Model 2 Saturn and a selection of Japanese games. For non-Japanese games that I have definitely legally acquired, I use an action replay cartridge flashed with a program called Pseudo Saturn. This allows you to play backups and games from other regions on any console and is definitely worth looking into if you want to get into the Saturn's full library without shelling out a ridiculous amount of money. So did the Saturn deserve the hand it was dealt? It's hard to say. The Saturn definitely wasn't a bad console in my eyes, or in the eyes of many people who experienced it. It's just that, put next to its competition, it's pretty clear that it wasn't really up to snuff. At least not in the West. Did it kill Sega? Probably not. They would have done that themselves somehow. It might have contributed, but I think it's unfair to place all the blame on the Saturn. Most of Sega's issues at the time came from management shortcomings and miscommunications. As far as my outlook on the console, it's got a special place in my heart. Coming from the little childhood knowledge that I had, only being able to poorly emulate it, to now actually having one, it feels like a certain curtain has been lifted. Some of its mystique is gone, but it still feels exotic to me. Like it's fictional somehow, a prop turned real. I'm glad it's gotten a second life with the cult following of some of its hidden gems, though. It seems to be getting its roses in the modern age. Not quite a headline, but more than a footnote.
Hey, Sit. Holy shit, is that a Sega Saturn?
Yeah. It is.
I fucking love the Sega Saturn.
I didn't even know you played video games.
Of course, man. I had one of these as a kid. I used to play all kinds of games.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, there was this fishing one and this racing one. Daytona, I think.
Daytona's good.
Oh, and yeah, Sonic.
Which?
And, Crazy Taxi. Good times.
Oh. That's the Dreamcast.
Huh?
That's the Sega Dreamcast you're thinking of, not the Saturn.
What? No. It's the one with, had the guy on the rollerblades. That was on there.
Yep. The Dreamcast.
Oh. Well, tomato, tomato. Anyway, get back to work. I'm gonna go up to the attic and see if I can find that thing. That doesn't mean stop working. Get a move on, chop chop.